Hello, everyone. We kick off. So, Tis Antarigeth and the worlds of the hero. So, I'm going to try to talk to you about Homer and talk to you about ways that we can engage ourselves and students in the fundamental aspects of what Homeric poetry is all about. And I'm going to riff around a little bit with and exploit some aspects of the OCR Class Civ A-level spec a little bit, and do this through exploring translation and what's at stake in translation, inviting you to ponder different options about what different translations might bring out. Some of you I know have the Greek and some of you don't, and that's not a problem at all. We'll be looking at the challenges that Homeric poetry and Homeric characters, Homeric scenarios generates, not just for the internal worlds of the poems, but for the idea of what we might think of as the world that is Homer, as something that we can interpret and help students to interpret right now. So not simply about immersing ourselves in that kind of plot, in that narrative, but immersing ourselves in trying to get to grips with the tension between that immersion in that mythological space and the questions that that mythological space and how Homeric poetry articulates it raises for us as we read our texts today in translation. So a little bit of kind of reception-y orientated thinking as well, which might help too. So what am I going to do? Starting with Tis Antarigeth Essayin, which is a part of Iliad 9, line 77, with the Greek text and 3 translations. Then I'm going to look at 3 further passages, and they're all similes, with the Greek text and 3 or 4 translations of each one. Q&A encouraged throughout, so thoughts, questions, options will arise all the time, hopefully. And depending on how we're going, we might have a little bit of time to think about the article that I shared, asked Paul to circulate, by Alex Purvis on the depth of Homeric surfaces from an interesting book called Deep Classics, which is about thinking about texts and thinking about classical reception of texts as part of the same thing, actually. Okay, so questions to ponder throughout. What makes a translation good or bad? To the extent that this is a fair question, given that I'm likely to be slightly harsher than you might expect to good old Evie Rue, bearing in mind that I have 4 different translations with me. What baggage comes with the way translators translate? So fundamentally, translation is interpretation. It's really, really important that translation of texts is an interpretation of them. And we'll see by looking at some of the translations, the options, that the routes that different translators go with. It's very useful for thinking about imagery in Homer because of the way that Homer stimulates different translators to respond, or indeed not respond, in different ways. So how do we deal with Homeric imagery? Not only what it is, but what it does. That's, moving from simply description and thinking about, saying what the formal features and properties of the Homeric text are that make these worlds alluring, in the sense that they are, but what their effects, drilling into that further question about what are the effects, how do we articulate how we respond to the stimulations of the core material, and why is that part of the experience of Homeric worlds? So, what do Homeric similes describe, to the extent this is a fair question? why might this matter? And the connection with the OCR learning outcome, learners should be able to critically explore and explain the possibility of different responses to a text from different audiences from the classical period up until the modern day. The possibility of different responses. And basically what I'm going to try and show you is that the Greek text stimulates the very possibility of different responses. And it does that through a question like, who would rejoice at that in Iliad 9? And through thinking about imagery, thinking about epic similes. Okay, so Tisan Tarigeth Eseien, Iliad 9:77. This is Nestor addressing Agamemnon on the special council of Achaeans, referring to the Trojan watchfires that are burning at the end of Book 8, which is obviously the beginning of the debate about what to do now that Achilles is withdrawn, and let's go and send the embassy to Achilles. Okay, and Nestor says, what man could be cheered to see this? Tisan Tarigeth Eseien. Robert Fagles in The Penguin says, what soldier could warm to that? So Latimore's line numbers are the same as the Greek text line numbers, because Latimore is a verse translation, matching very closely to the line numbers of the original Greek. Fagles is also a verse translation. My dog-eared copy of Fagles' Iliad translation is also a poetic translation, but he takes liberties with the line numbers. So he gives you at the top of the page the line numbers, the page range, the line range of the pages of the original Greek, but invents his own line numbers for his own translation down the side. And Ivaru, who finds them a pleasant sight. So he doesn't give you line numbers because he's translating it as prose. He gives you line numbers, I think, every 5 to 10 lines, but you can't actually identify which lines exactly he's referring to because of the prose translation. We'll maybe talk a little bit about the differences and the options of translating Homer as verse or prose. I think it's going to be obvious that I want people to think that verse translations are the way forward, but that they're difficult, and that not that prose translations are terrible necessarily, but that they come with interpretative baggage, because they're interpretations of a style of reading Homer that makes Homer accessible, but comes with limitations and comes with maybe shortcuts that, reading the Greek text or comparing and looking at multiple translations might give more of a sense of. To the extent that I have ideas, I have certain views, and I'll kind of highlight bits of the translations as I go along to say, look, might be something that's coming out here, but I want to kind of leave Homer as a kind of a blank interpretative slate, really, for you to make the kinds of connections that you want to explore because of the affordances, as it were, of the original text and the affordances of different translations that you want to feel are speaking particular things about Homer. Okay, so who would be cheered at this? What do we think about this as a translation? Well, the kinds of things I want to say about this as a translation is look at especially the way Latimore and Fagles have translated tis, who, in Greek. It doesn't say, even if you can't read the Greek, you can't see a word for soldier there. You can't see a word for man there. There's no noun, right? We just have tis, a pronoun. Right? What man? Who? Not even man, necessarily. It's not even masculine. Right? So, Rue here, who finds them a pleasant sight, is probably the most accurate translation. But he's chosen to italicize them, and I might have chosen to italicize who. He's reminding you in terms of the narrative. He's reminding you of what happened before, reminding you of the bit in the narrative world of the plot, what happened at the end of Book 8, as a follow-on. Right? Homer is doing that with Tade, reminding you of what happened back at the end of Book 8. But he's also asking the rhetorical question, who finds them a pleasant sight. Now that could be interpreted, especially on Rue's translation, as simply something about Nestor talking to the rest of the Achaeans. Well, who would find that? Who would enjoy that as a pleasant thing? Okay? But that tis, I want to suggest, resonates further than simply the internal world of the poem. And I'll suggest why it does that in a particular way in a little moment. But I'm going to come to another passage first. Okay. So, similes. I'm going to start with perhaps the most famous simile in all of Homer, which isn't one taken from the OCR spec. Book 8, I don't think, is on the OCR spec. But if you're talking about similes, you can't really not do the Gorgythion poppy simile. Think about this. So, Latimor's translation. So, Teucer hitting the wrong person and shooting a son of Priam instead. And we get this extraordinary imagery of the garden poppy and the rains of springtime. Latimor's translation, Fagles' translation, Rue's translation. And again, there are questions, options about how to translate this. Latimore is usually the most accurate, most kind of, as it were, pedestrianly accurate of all the Homeric translations. He's directly going for the word, trying to get the word order, getting the line numbers matching up pretty much. You feel that in terms of accuracy, this is pretty strong. And I've identified with Latimor's translation in bold the rains of springtime as an accurate translation of Noti esite earinesin in line 307. Because it doesn't, the rains of springtime there are plural rains. And the springtimes, springtime rain showers, right? Plural, not just necessarily one-off events. Okay. Other translations, especially Fagles' goes for a very different option and says a sudden spring shower. And Rue, again, is actually better here, because, again, the showers of spring. The showers of spring as a general remark. Fagles has got sucked into thinking that the simile needs to be translated in the same way that the narrative of the event of his shooting needs to be translated, right? As a one-off event, right? That the Homeric world creates for you. The Greek text doesn't do that quite because of the plural springs, the plural rainstorms, showers. And that's interesting because, again, it talks to you about what translators do with narrative, and that translators sometimes get sucked into thinking that similes need to be the same kind of narrative as the main narrative of the mythology, because they seem to need to kind of reinforce the particularity of the event that is being narrated. Now, they do reinforce the particularity of the event being narrated, but they do that in poetry. And poetry isn't a one-off event. Poetry isn't like the death of Gorgythion, that it happens and goes away and stops and it never happens again. Right? It's not a sudden springtime shower. Right? Homer is not like that at all. So I think, we want to be prepared to look at what's at stake here. Way down in the garden by its seed and the showers of spring, you feel again like maybe Rue is getting sucked into another kind of narratival mode. He wants to tell you a big story about this garden and is kind of prevented from doing so because that's not what the simile allows him to do. And Rue is kind of constrained by Homeric narrative the limits of Homeric narrative from the kind of storytelling that he wants to tell with Homer as in a kind of novelistic kind of approach. And we obviously know that novels themselves can be lyrical, can be poetic, of course, but I think that Rue is kind of straining at the leash a little bit, like what Homer isn't really allowing him to do. He wants to be able to kind of extend beyond this kind of thing. Rue elsewhere, so whose mother, lovely Castianera, with a figure like a goddess, had come from Isomere to be married to Priam, is a slightly more extended, wordy, narratival response to what the Greek actually says in lines 305 to 6, which is much more accurately translated in Lattimore. Gorgythion, whose mother was lovely Castianera, Priam's bride from Isomere with the form of a goddess. With the form of a goddess, Demas e quia theesi, like in her body to female divinities, that's what the Greek technically says, has a stature and stateliness to it, maybe, that we might want to kind of think isn't quite captured by Rue's translation, with a figure like a goddess, exclamation mark. Maybe a 1950s kind of slightly odd kind of formulation. But again, the point here is that, Rue is kind of sucked into wanting to tell you a story about Gorgythion's mother that the Homeric text isn't quite fully wanting you to do, allowing you to do on its own terms. Fagles' translation, you can really feel like he's really pulling out the stops to offer a poetic kind of interpretation of what Homer's Greek might actually mean, might actually make you think. This is where translation as interpretation really comes out obviously. So lovely Castianera, lithe as a deathless goddess. Lithe is an interpretation of what the Greek says. So like in her demas, in her body to goddesses, that invites you to think, how is Castianera's body like goddesses' bodies? What do we know about goddesses' bodies? What can we say about that? So Homer is leaving room for you to flesh out what that even means. Fagles has come along and said, right, lithe, I'll use that word. Why is he using that word? And I was thinking about this. Well, maybe he's used that word because he's subtly introducing the idea of bodies, because the simile focuses your mind on Gorgythion's body and its own strange, perverse, kind of paradoxical, ironic, tragic kind of bending, its own kind of litheness. And poppies, Homer doesn't say the poppy is red, of course. Poppies are all kinds of colours. So burst into red bloom. So he's interpreting there. Full seeds. Weighed down by, Homer says, carpo, fruit. It's seed. He doesn't say full seeds. So again, Fagles is pulling out the stops and thinking he's adding words to make you think what the interpretations of this passage might mean. So fertility, death, loss, fragility, flowers as a kind of surrogate for all that lost mortal potential might make you feel. This is where Fagles is really lyrical in his kind of interpretation of Homeric similes, and I want to encourage that kind of thinking about Homeric similes. As a point of kind of order, my research is on lyric poetry, so I wish that there are, I wish to identify and encourage identification of aspects of Homeric poetics that are more lyrical than is often kind of felt. And translations like this are a really good place to go for that. Yes?
Hi, sorry, it's kind of a bit off topic. Where does the ancient Greek, that is literally Greek to me,
Yep.
where does it put the verb? So I'm just wondering, Leo seems to be delaying that final action to the very last bit of the drop to one side. He's sort of stretching action and then say
Yeah.
made by Palmer.
Yes. So it is in my. I'm pointing at the screen. It's in the line. Yeah, the third line from the bottom. Mercon hos heterosi cerebellum. He bent, drooping his head to one side like a poppy. Like a poppy. He.
Yeah.
It says that, in the third line from the bottom. And yes, so the Greek text interacts. Yeah, the image with the action in a way that Fagles is Latimore's translation kind of brings out. And I guess we got the final line reinforces that with the hose, because we've got hose. So he did that. So the poppy was like that. So his head bent slack. So we've got two heads: the poppy's head and the man's head. But Mercon hose, like a poppy. You might think that was just the analogy, and that was it. But Homer, the blurring, that line blurs the extent to which we're in an imagistic space, as opposed to still in the narrative. We kind of still are in the, we're not, that blurring is, I think, kind of important. Now, translators have to make decisions about how to do this, and you can see that kind of, coming across here in the different ways. Yeah. Right. So back to who would find that, who would take joy in that. End of Iliad 8. The very last lines of Iliad 8. To make glad the heart of the shepherd. Gigerthi de Banana Poimen. So the Trojans are camped out on the plain, really near the ships, which is what causes the disturbed special assembly of the Achaeans, where Nestor says, "Who would rejoice at looking at that?" Right? Now that responds directly or indirectly, actually more directly than the translators give credence to this passage at the end of Iliad 8, because the words are the same. That verb in the Greek, to make glad, gigerthi, Homer has already given you an answer to the rhetorical question that Nestor asks, Tisan tarigethesein, who would take pleasure in that? We've already been given a sense of somebody taking pleasure in a scene that then we find the internal characters on the Greek side rhetorically say who would take pleasure at that. Okay. Now, none of the translators, actually, that I've given, make that correspondence at all. They use different words, where the Greek actually uses the same verb, gegerthi, gerthio. So the shepherd's heart exults. Go back again. So who would be cheered to see this? What will warm to that? So Fagles, warm, playing with a pun on the warmth of the fires burning and the warmth of a heart as a kind of figurative response to pleasure. And Rue find them a pleasant sight. To make glad the heart of the shepherd is much more accurate, direct translation of the simile. And the shepherd's heart exults, and the shepherd rejoices in his heart, is Rue's translation. So this is my answer to Tisan tarigethesein, who would rejoice at these things, is an answer that we know more about. We're informed more about than the internal characters of the start of Iliad 9. Right? Why does that matter? Because it expands the question of what Homeric actions and thinking about Homeric actions actually do. Because they're not simply rooted in the world of the heroic action on the battlefield. They become part of the imagery of a simile, but the simile then asks us questions, right? About to what extent is this shepherd's response in the simile an appropriate response that fits with the narrative situation? Do we want to have the same response as Nestor? Do we want to have the same response as the shepherd? This question multiplies, and we'll look again and later on as another example of the same kind of thing going on, but in one simple example. No, not a simple example at all, but one individual case. Think about how the interaction in the resonance of Homeric verse, the resonance between Homeric narrative and Homeric imagery, stimulates thinking about not just, what do you feel about entering that kind of world and imagining that you're Nestor, or entering the world where poetry figures this kind of thing, and that enjoying poetry, enjoying the pleasure of imagery, is also being figured here and instantiated in the actual offering of this kind of analogy. But it's not a straightforward analogy, right? Because Homeric similes don't famously, straightforwardly, directly map, right? Homeric similes don't, as we've just seen with the poppy simile, right? And all the interpretative options about how to deal with that especially Fagles brings out. There's no way of straightforwardly saying why a simile does what it does, how it directly relates. How we even translate it causes trouble here. I just wanted to highlight, so obviously the most important point here is Gegerthi de frena poimen, and the shepherd rejoices in his heart at this scene of phenomenal natural beauty. That's the most important point about this passage. But thinking about how other bits of language here get figured. So how the simile uses language that might be more appropriate to the heroic world to characterize nature. So glittering, ari prepia, preeminent, standing out, right? In all their glory, right? That word, that phrase isn't in the Greek text, right? But Fagles is bringing that out by emphasizing a significance for him of the appearance, of the preeminence of this vision of the night sky, right? Glittering the stars in all their glory. Okay? Not there in the original Greek, but it's an interpretation. Again, Latimore, ari prepia, in all their glory. It just means very outstanding, very visible, ari prepia. But it is a word that can be used figuratively to characterize human beings as preeminent. I haven't given you any parallels for that, but that is why these translators are doing that. Other little bits of detail here, which I've emphasized. The horses. Extraordinary end to Book 8. An extraordinarily calming scene, right? Seemingly. Right? 1,000 fires were burning there on the plain, and beside each fire sat 50 fighting men poised in the leaping blaze. Full stop. End of 3 lines from the end. Poros aithomanoia. Full stop. Hippoide. We want to start a new sentence. The horses were doing something. Right? And Champso. Latimore. So he, full stop. Last 2 lines. And standing each beside his chariot, chomping white barley and oats, the horses waited for the dawn to mount to a high place. should probably start the sentence with horses, to be honest, or to really mark the difference. Like the focus in that extraordinarily kind of zooming cinematic aspect that Homer is often really absolutely mind-bogglingly good at. Focusing in on that micro-level detail. Having set out this extraordinarily massive, preeminent vista, focusing on the horses eating their barley and oats, waiting for the dawn. And famously, this is a spondaic ending of the book, of the line here, Hestartes parakesphin euthronon eomimnon. They waited for dawn. Slow, spondaic, delayed, restful, peaceful end to the book, to the passage. And then all kept kind of offset then subsequently by the total chaos of the start of Book 9. And there's a magnanimity and a magnificence to the way in which these last two lines finish this book in a perhaps a very unexpected emphasis. Which I think some of the translations could bring out more. So, and champing oats and glistening barley stationed by the chariot stallions waited for dawn to mount her glowing throne. It's like it's just part of the complete sequence. And it feels to me slightly more set out from that sequence. And Rue has, while horses stood beside their chariots, munching white barley and rye, and awaiting dawn on her golden throne. It's a subordinate clause for Rue. More important things are happening. Right? Homer doesn't do that. He says hippoi there, and horses were doing that. Changes the focus. So Rue has taken the option of subsuming the focus on the horses into the broader importance of the narratival, scene. Homer isn't quite offering that, although it's fake, Rue is offering that as an interpretation. I also think munching maybe isn't quite the right word. Edeptomenoi. So maybe a neutral word, but munching feels tonally slightly improved by chomping. Okay. How are we doing for time? We're okay. Anyone got any questions about this? It's important for me to kind of show you that even when you don't expect Homeric narrative to interact potentially with similes, it can do. And why that's important is because it can set off new thoughts in your mind. And you think you have read something about somebody enjoying something in Homer before Nestor has said what he said about the same thing. Right? It multiplies the possibilities. It multiplies the complexity of thinking about your response to what you're seeing, imagining somebody seeing. The whole idea of thinking with seeing is also very important here, which will come up again in the next passage. Okay. So, Odyssey 8:521 to 3:1. And I think I've got 4 translations of this passage. So Lattimore, Odysseus crying, and the simile of a widow. Probably equally the most famous simile in the Odyssey, along with the reunification simile in Odyssey 23. And I'll explore in the next few minutes a little bit of the ways in which translations deal with this and what might be at issue, and a little bit of bibliography as well to just talk through. Okay, so there's Lattimore's pretty straight translation, I think. I haven't flagged anything particularly challenging about that. Then we have Emily Wilson's translation, the most recent famous translator of the Odyssey. You can feel that this is a much more poetic translation, trying to do something with the shape of the verses that Emily is herself producing to respond to the effect of how a poet might actually deal with, as a woman, deal with this simile. So notice all the enjambment in Wilson's translation as a way of emphasizing the effect of the grief of this woman's experience. Right? Some of which picks out aspects of the Greek text. So I suppose the bit where it says in the middle there, hoite hopiste, koptontes duresi metaphronon edikaemus eireron eisanagusin, the way the lines kind of flow on in the middle of the passage. The men are right behind her, they hit her shoulders. So hoite hopiste, and the men are right behind her, is a direct translation of those words in the Greek. Hoi, hopiste, behind her. But she puts a full stop to force the kind of the sequence of lines across to mark the effect. The men are right behind her. They hit her shoulders with their spears and lead her to slavery, hard labor, and a life of pain, emphasizing the last word, or is done, of the third line from the end, by using enjambment to emphasize that in her translation of pain. Right? So using different line lengths to articulate a different kind of bring out for what Wilson feels is the most intense way of translating this passage. So then we have E.V. Roux's translation. Again, he's committed to narrative. While the famous minstrel was singing, Odysseus' heart was melting with grief. It's not quite what the Greek says. This is what the famous singer sang, but Odysseus, teketo. Again, enjambment. Startling. But Odysseus, what did Odysseus do? He melted. Right. And then equally pitiful were the tears that now welled up in Odysseus' eyes. Homer doesn't say equally, he says hose. He says like that. Right? Ryu has made a decision by saying equally over a direct parallelism between Odysseus' grief at the storytelling and the woman in the simile's experience. Is that a fair thing to do? Well, I think it's kind of slightly cutting the Gordian knot of the way in which hose and the way in which Homeric similes ask the question about likeness. And we will come back to that in a minute. So, Alice Ostwald. Now, if I had time, I would show you Alice Ostwald actually reading this out. There's a link there to a YouTube video of her lecture as Oxford Professor of Poetry, where she talks about this simile. And I've just got some quotes from her. So the great singer sang, but Odysseus liquefied teketo. He turned into water, into liquid. It's what the verb means, tekamai, melts. Right? The tears ran out under his eyelids onto his cheeks, as when a woman crumples over, so forth. Okay. And again, line lengths responding to different aspects of this simile, and again, we've got a female poet responding in an affecting way to the same thing. She calls this an eerie simile, because the woman has a kind of really distressing, continued presence in our minds, in Odysseus' mind, in our minds when we're reading and encountering this passage, right? Which reminds me a bit of the way in which the rains of springtime in the Iliad Gorgythion simile persist. Can you imagine multiple rainstorms, multiple poppies, this happening loads of times? Okay, this isn't just a one-off event, but it's happening because there's a presence here Unfortunately, this kind of experience doesn't go away. It stays with us in our minds, in our culture, in our experiences of war. Okay? And Oswald's view is to say, well, I know that, and I'm a poet, and I know Homer, and we're dealing with that, or attempting to deal with that. Deal with that persistence. So, thoughts. Here we go. Oswald. It's a simile about similarity. And a simile about tears. Tears as the messengers of similarity. The way that widow interrupts the narrative with her weeping, not as a ghost, or a sign, or a memory, but as a stranger in the language with her own vivid existence. The way her scream goes on damaging the mind. That tells me something about grief itself and how poetry might rise to meet it. And my hope is that similes will repair what gets broken by the biographies. In the same way that the natural world does, I think of simile as a healing art. We want poetry to heal and mediate grief. And we want to pay attention to the form in which it does that, as at least a hope that that kind of devastating experience that persists in poetry will have its counterpart in the aesthetic allure of the manifestation of that experience, however much that damages our minds. And I think that's a really fascinating way of not just reading the tears, Odysseus' tears simile in Odyssey 8, but reading all those other passages, thinking about not just the content of the narrative, but the way the poetry mediates, as poetry mediates that narratival experience. It's a simile about similarity. I think that's really cool. So there's a bit of bibliography at the end, and again I'll ask Paul to circulate the slides. It's a bit of bibliography. So Jonas Gretlein has an article in a journal on aesthetics. It's called an article called Aesthetics, Ancient and Modern. And here is riffing across a couple of pages about ways that classicists have interpreted that Odyssey simile. Thinking about modeling audiences' responses. And that's the whole deal with Odyssey 8, right? Is that Homer, in general, across the Iliad and Odyssey, models audience experiences and reactions, but does it in different ways, at different times, and with different intensities. Shield of Achilles in the Iliad, in Iliad 18, is one very, very important way in which Homer models and challenges the interpretability of his worlds. This passage in Odyssey 8, in the broader scheme of singers, a singer, Demodocus, singing tales about Troy, is another one. And so he's talking here about how different scholars articulate different responses to the ways in which we should feel with the Phaeacians or with Odysseus. Because the point is the Odyssey manifests a different reaction. Because the Phaeacians don't understand why Odysseus is crying to this stuff that he should be enjoying. Poetry's fun, right? And scholars come along and say, well, actually, we should be prioritizing Odysseus' tears because they're obviously the right way of thinking. Well, maybe. But I think, Gretlein, has a point here. I think it's neither necessary nor helpful to choose one over the other. The diverging reactions of the Phaeacians and Odysseus rather outline a spectrum across which the various responses of Homer's audience can range. Say audiences, right? Somewhere from detached pleasure to strong involvement, including tears, besides illustrating the intensity that aesthetic experience can gain. Demodocus' recitals reveal the wide range of possible responses and their dependence on the stance of the recipient. Okay. The Odyssey highlights the experiential character of responses to narrative. Narrative is more than a means of representation. The strong reactions it can provoke drive home its capacity to create presence. Put capacity in question mark after it, so I put that in because I think capacity to create presence. Hope that it might create presence. Or is that question of, the eeriness of the persistence of that woman grieving over the death of her husband in the simile in Odyssey 8. To what extent is that a presence? Do we think that's a presence? What do we mean by that? So I think I want to preserve a sense of doubt or a sense of risk, that poetry says these things and dangles these ideas before you and wants you to commit to them, but knows that you might not. Right? So its capacity to create presence, I think, may be going a bit far. And this will help you. I mean, I could give a similar kind of lecture about imagery in Sappho, and I'd be saying pretty much the same thing. Do we want to think that the flowers in Sappho Fragment 96 are present for you? Maybe not. There's an extra stage to go to argue that they might be. Okay. So two audiences are rather hinged together in a way that lets them grind against each other. Sometimes the external audience smoothly continues the reaction of the internal audience. Sometimes it rubs against it. The simultaneous generation of and reflection on aesthetic experience gives meta-narrative an additional twist and makes it more intriguing than theoretical treatises. Aristotle. Don't worry about Aristotle. Read poetry. Think about how poetry can mess with your head, about how narrative is supposed to work. And not only how it's supposed to work, but what it does, what it might do to you. Okay. So I'm going to kind of finish there. We have run out of time, really, to concentrate and look a little bit about the Purvis article, which I circulated. But I will just say a few points about it in relation to what I've said today, because essentially we're coming from the same kind of position, where I want to disrupt the prioritization of narrative depth as opposed to aesthetic surface. And I think similes in Homer are the really obvious ways of doing that. That it's not that Homeric worlds aren't simply about, the Homeric world isn't simply about your commitment to enjoying and understanding the plot of the Iliad and Odyssey. However much a translation like Roux, who wants you to think of the Odyssey and Iliad as novels, might want you to do, or might imply that you do, or might pull you into doing. However much we know that the history of novels are fundamentally influenced by Homer, and the Odyssey especially, as various bits of ancient literary criticism in fact tell us. And the history of novels is very complex, and I'm not going to say that an amazing translation of the Odyssey couldn't be written in prose, although I don't think Evie Roux is it. I want to foster this idea that Homeric surfaces, the surface and contours of Homeric description, Homeric aesthetics, Homeric language in detail, and the options that translators offer those of you who don't have Greek to get a sense of that, can do more than simply sucking you into, unreflectively into, the mythological space. That the world of Homer is more, the worlds of Homer are much more than that mythological space. Because they build into that all this kind of reflection about it, and about what it does, and what the reactions in that mythological space are. Thank you. Sorry, questions? Questions?
What do you think about Klein? Because we have to choose between real or Klein when we teach the Odyssey in classical civilization. So if I was looking out to other translations like Henry Wilson's, that we have to have one of those two texts.
Yeah.
So which one would you
I have to say I don't know Klein. So is Klein another prose translation?
No, that one's, I believe it's in verse.
It's a verse translation. I suppose I would have to, I would have to go into another another version of this to try and figure it out. What do other people think about the options of the translations you have? Do you use, multiple translations? I say, all of the translations I have with me. Yes?
I was going to say, we use Emily Wilson to really good effect. We switched from the video and actually found it much better than Emily Wilson this year. And it doesn't make much difference that it's not quoted in the exam. They still know what it's referring to. Yeah, because they have those little excerpts that they can put.
It's not, and I don't want to, Emily Wilson responded to me on social media today, so she popped Rue in the bin. She said, "You're being really unfair." And I am being really unfair. And I thought, well, and I'm at pains not to not say, it's totally terrible. And you've seen ways in which it isn't, because there are bits of it that actually get closest to the Greek, but it's inconsistent. And I think the more you can just vary your options a little bit, just to test the ways of building in what I was saying about the possibility of response, that translations manifest that possibility of response. The more possible translations you kind of look at a little bit, the more you'll get a sense of how different people are pulling out different nuances from the Greek. Obviously, I'd encourage you all to learn Homeric Greek and be able to respond to that. It's probably unrealistic, but you have to try the hope. Any other questions? Hopefully, that was helpful. I was kind of tempting to want to do something more theoretical, but I want to kind of think, actually, what you do. How to help you in what you do in your classrooms with the direct material that you're working with, to get students to ask the right questions in the right ways of the right kind of material. See what I mean? And I think this is probably quite a useful thing. So anyway, I will circulate this, send it to Paul to give you to circulate. The Alice Oswald video is pretty cool, so enjoy that. Get students to enjoy reading classical literature as literature. One of the things that I want to say, actually, I will use this opportunity to say this now, is one of the weaknesses I feel among its many strengths, one of the weaknesses of the classical civilization spec at A level is it blurs the boundaries for literature between thinking of literature as literature and thinking about literature as cultural history. And that's going to be a problem for some of you, depending on what backgrounds you're coming from, as teachers of classics, whether you're historians or you're English literature, or you are classicists. And I'm very definitely telling you, it's literature.